the sun was the first thing you learned to hate. It wasn't an enemy you could fight, not like a rattler in the brush or a bandit on the trail. It was a constant, unblinking sovereign, a brass eye in a bleached blue sky that watched without pity and gave without warmth, offering only a dry, baking heat that sucked the life from the land and the hope from a man's heart. It beat down on the red earth, cracking it into a web of thirsty fissures. And it beat down on the lone figure of a woman walking the scar of a road that cut through the endless expanse of the prairie. Her name was Elena, though she hadn't heard it spoken with any kindness in so long she sometimes felt it belonged to someone else, a girl from a different life. She was 25, but the grit etched into the corners of her eyes and the weary set of her shoulders made her look older. The road to Broken Mesa Ranch was long, and she had been walking since before that cruel sun had first crested the horizon, painting the eastern sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. Her dress, a calico of a faded blue that might once have been cheerful, was now the color of the dusty sky, thin and worn at the elbows and hem. It clung to her damply. A second skin of sweat and dust. Her boots, the sturdiest thing she owned, were scuffed and cracked, the soles worn thin enough that she could feel the sharp temper of every stone on the path. With each step, a puff of ochre dust rose, coating her ankles, settling on the fabric of her skirt, a constant reminder of the earth's indifference. In her arms, she clutched a bundle wrapped in a square of linen, holding it to her chest like a shield. It was everything she had in the world: a spare chemise, a thin wool shawl for the cold desert nights, a small, dog-eared book of psalms whose words had long since blurred into meaningless shapes, and a bar of harsh lye soap. Tucked within the folds of the chemise was the one thing of true value, a small, tarnished silver locket on a delicate chain. She never opened it. The memories inside were heavier than the bundle itself. She had left the last town, if you could call a dusty street with a general store, a saloon, and a blacksmith's forge, a town 3 days ago. The man at the store, a portly fellow with sweat stains under his arms, had looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and pity when she'd asked for directions. Broken Mesa, he'd grunted, wiping his hands on his apron. That's Colt Maddox's place, a long walk, and he ain't known for his hospitality. He'd sold her a small sack of hardtack and a canteen of water, his eyes lingering on her for a moment too long before he turned away. She didn't need him to tell her it was a long walk. She felt it in the burning of her calves, in the deep, settled ache in her spine, and in the raw chafe of the worn leather of her boots against her skin. And she didn't need to be warned about Colt Maddox. A man who lived that far from anyone else did so for a reason. He either didn't want company, or company didn't want him. Either way, it suited her fine. Company was what she was running from. The wind was a restless companion on the plains. It whispered through the brittle, yellowed grass and sighed around the stunted sagebrush that dotted the landscape. It carried the scent of dust and distant rain that never fell, and it stole the moisture from her lips, leaving them cracked and sore. Today, it seemed to have a mean streak, gusting suddenly to throw a fine spray of grit into her face. She lowered her head, pulling the brim of her simple bonnet down, and blinked the sting from her eyes. The wind didn't care. The sun didn't care. The land itself was a vast, sprawling monument to apathy. It was a place that could swallow a person whole and leave no trace. This thought, which should have been terrifying, brought a strange sort of comfort. To be traceless was to be free. She was running from a life that had become a cage, its bars forged from broken promises and a quiet, creeping dread. She was fleeing a man whose hands could be gentle one moment and heavy the next, whose words of affection were so often a prelude to a storm of temper. She had endured it for 2 years, telling herself that this was what was meant for her, that a woman alone had no better prospects. But one morning, after a night of listening to his drunken snores while her own body throbbed with a dull, familiar pain, she had seen her reflection in the murky water of the washing basin. The woman looking back was a stranger, her eyes hollow, her spirit worn as thin as her dress. In that moment, something inside her had finally broken. Or perhaps it had finally mended itself into a single, sharp point of resolve. She had waited until he left for the saloon, then packed her small bundle, leaving behind everything he had ever given her. She walked out of that small, suffocating house without looking back, because to look back was to risk turning into a pillar of salt, frozen by regret and fear. The job at Broken Mesa Ranch was a rumor, a wisp of a thing she'd overheard in the town. A ranch hand had been complaining that Maddox's cooking was so bad it could kill a buzzard. "He needs a woman out there," the man had said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Someone to cook and clean, but who'd be fool enough to go?" Elena had held her breath, her heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "I would," she thought. "I would be that fool. A place to stay, a roof over her head, and work to occupy her hands and mind. It was more than she had. It was a chance to be useful, to earn her keep in a way that didn't involve sacrificing pieces of her soul." The sun climbed higher, reaching its zenith. There was no shade. The world was shadowless, exposed. She stopped for a moment, her breath coming in shallow pants, and uncorked her canteen. The water was warm and tasted of tin, but it was the most precious thing she possessed. She allowed herself only 3 small sips, rationing it with the discipline of a seasoned traveler. As she drank, she scanned the horizon. In the shimmering heat haze, she thought she could see it, a dark, jagged line against the sky. The mesa, Broken Mesa. Her hope, a fragile, battered thing, flickered. It was still so far. She pushed onward, her world shrinking to the rhythm of her own weary footsteps. Left, right, crunch, crunch. The sun on her back, the bundle in her arms. The past was a shadow at her heels, and the future was a smudge on the horizon. All that existed was the now, this single, agonizing step, and then the next. She thought about the cooking. She was a good cook when she had the ingredients and the peace of mind to do it. Her mother had taught her. She could make a stew from almost anything, bake bread that was light and crusty, and make coffee strong enough to fortify a man against a blizzard. She clung to these small, practical skills. They were real. They were hers. No one could take them away from her. They were her currency in this new, uncertain life. As the afternoon wore on, the mesa grew larger, its craggy face resolving into detail. It looked like a giant's broken tooth jutting from the gums of the earth, and below it, nestled at its base, she could finally make out the faint, geometric shapes of buildings. A house, a barn, corrals, smoke, thin and gray as a ghost, rose from a chimney, a fragile signal of life in the vast emptiness. Broken Mesa Ranch. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and her knees buckled. She stumbled, catching herself before she fell, and leaned against a lonely, wind-scoured boulder by the side of the road. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was real. It wasn't a mirage. She sat for a moment in the meager shade of the rock, her body trembling with exhaustion and a sudden, overwhelming wave of fear. What if the storekeeper was right? What if Colt Maddox was a monster? What if he took one look at her and sent her away? Where would she go then? The wilderness stretched for miles in every direction. There was nowhere else. She closed her eyes, her fingers tightening around the bundle. She had not come this far to give up now. She had walked away from one kind of monster. She would not be scared off by the mere reputation of another. The man she'd left behind had a charming smile and a cruel heart. Perhaps a man known for his harshness would be honest in his dealings. Perhaps his cruelty, if he had any, would be plain to see, not hidden behind false smiles and sweet words. An open enemy was better than a secret one. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she pushed herself back to her feet. Her legs felt like lead, but she forced them to move. The final mile was the hardest. The ranch seemed to recede with every step she took, a cruel trick of the heat and the endless space. She could see the details now, the sagging top rail of a fence, the weathered gray of the barn's wood, the dark, unwelcoming rectangles of the windows on the main house. It was not a welcoming place. It looked as tired and beaten down by the elements as she felt. It was a place built for survival, not for comfort. As she drew near the turnoff, a crude wooden signpost leaned drunkenly. The words burned into the wood. Broken Mesa Ranch. Trespassers will be dealt with. The finality of it, the stark, unfriendly warning, sent a chill through her despite the heat. This was it, the end of the road. The wind picked up again. Stronger this time, a harbinger of the coming evening. It whipped a strand of her dark hair from beneath her bonnet and lashed it across her face. It carried the scent of cattle and dry hay, the smells of work and life, and it blew a cloud of that fine, red dust straight into her eyes, making them water. She stood there, at the entrance to her last, best hope, blinking away tears that were not from sorrow, but from the simple, persistent grit of the land itself. It felt like a warning, a final, harsh welcome to the life that lay ahead. It would not be easy. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, squared her weary shoulders, and walked toward the house. The path from the leaning signpost to the house was 100 yards of judgment. Elena felt it with every step. The house didn't just sit on the land. It stared from it, a block of weathered timber and dusty glass that seemed to resent her intrusion. There were no flowers in the yard, no whitewashed fence, none of the small touches that might suggest a home. There was only packed dirt, a solitary, skeletal-looking cottonwood tree, and a long porch lost in shadow, its silence as profound and unwelcoming as the plains themselves. Her boots crunched on a loose stone, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet air. Before she could even reach the first of the 3 steps leading to the porch, the front door opened. The man who filled the doorway was framed by the darkness behind him, a hard silhouette against the gloom. He was tall, broader in the shoulders than she'd expected, and carried himself with a stillness that was more menacing than any sudden movement. As he stepped out onto the porch, the late afternoon sun caught him, revealing a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape he inhabited. This had to be Colt Maddox. He was perhaps 35, his face tanned to the color of worn leather and etched with lines that spoke of sun and worry. His hair was the color of dark earth, long enough to brush the collar of his dusty shirt. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, stormy gray, the color of a winter sky, and they were narrowed with a suspicion so deep it looked like a permanent part of him. He wasn't just looking at her. He was dissecting her, taking in her faded dress, the pathetic bundle in her arms, and the exhaustion she knew was plain on her face. His hands hung loose at his sides, not far from the worn leather belt at his hips. He said nothing. The silence stretched, becoming a weight, a test. Elena's throat was a desert. She swallowed, the sound painful. Her voice, when it came, was a reedy thing, barely more than a whisper. Yet she forced it to be steady. I was told, in town, I heard you might be in need of a cook. Colt Maddox didn't move a muscle. His gaze remained fixed on her, hard and unreadable. Another long moment passed, long enough for her to feel the tremor start in her hands. She tightened her grip on her bundle. Who told you that his voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together? It wasn't a question so much as an accusation. Just talk, she said, her own voice gaining a sliver of strength from the friction of his hostility. A man in the general store. I didn't get his name. He took a step forward, to the edge of the porch, and now he was above her. He looked down, and she had to fight the instinct to flinch, to lower her gaze. She had promised herself she would not be cowed again. She met his stare, hoping he couldn't see the frantic beating of her heart. His eyes swept over her again, more slowly this time. He saw the frayed hem of her skirt, the mended tear near the shoulder, the thinness of her wrists. He saw a stray, a creature at the end of its rope, and his expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened further. He had seen strays before. They always wanted something more than what they asked for. "I need someone to cook my meals and keep the house from falling to ruin," he said, his tone flat and cold as a river stone. "That is all. This is a ranch, not a charity. It isn't a place for lost souls to find their way." He took another step, coming down to stand on the dirt in front of her. They were on level ground now, but he still seemed to tower over her. "You work, you get a room, and you get to eat. You cause an ounce of trouble, you bring your past knocking on my door, or you get any ideas in your head that your job is more than what I say it is, and you're gone. The road you came in on will be waiting for you." He paused, letting the words sink in. A torrent of cold water meant to extinguish any spark of hope she might have had for kindness. "You are here only to cook," he said, his voice dropping even lower, each word a precisely laid brick in the wall he was building between them. "Don't expect anything else." For a moment, all Elena could hear was the wind sighing through the lone cottonwood. This was it, the offer, such as it was, a roof in exchange for servitude, a sanctuary that felt like a prison. But the memory of what she had left behind was a fresh burn, and the emptiness of the plains behind her was a far greater threat than the coldness of the man in front of her. She had no other choice. A life of cold. Clear rules was better than a life of unpredictable cruelty. She gave a single sharp nod. "I understand." He stared at her for a second longer, as if searching for a lie in her eyes, finding none, or perhaps simply deciding he didn't care enough to look further. He turned his back on her. "The kitchen is through there," he grunted, gesturing vaguely toward the front door. "Your room is the small one off the back. The well is out by the barn. Don't waste the water." Without another word, he strode away, his long legs eating up the ground as he headed toward the corrals, where a solitary horse stood swishing its tail. He didn't look back. The transaction was complete. He had hired a pair of hands. The woman they were attached to was of no consequence. Elena stood frozen for a moment, the tension draining out of her so quickly it left her feeling lightheaded. She had done it. She had a place. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and walked up the steps, her boots sounding hollow on the wooden porch. The inside of the house was dark and smelled of stale air, old smoke and dust. The main room was sparse, containing a rugged table, 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace black with soot. A rifle was mounted above the mantelpiece. Everything was coated in a fine layer of the same red dust that covered the world outside. It was clear this was a place a man passed through, not where he lived. She found the kitchen. It was worse. A stack of dirty dishes sat in a dry basin, coated with the remains of meals past. The cast-iron stove was cold, its surface greasy. A film of dust covered every surface, dulling the wood of the cupboards and the tin of the countertop. It was a room that had been abandoned, given up on, for the first time all day. A feeling other than fear or exhaustion stirred in Elena. It was a flicker of purpose. This, at least, was a problem she knew how to solve. She left her bundle in the small, closet-like room off the kitchen. It contained a narrow cot with a thin mattress and 1 threadbare blanket, and tied her hair back with a scrap of cloth. She found a bucket and headed for the well. The rest of the day passed in a blur of motion. She worked with a quiet, desperate energy, fueled by the knowledge that her survival depended on her usefulness. She hauled water, heated it on the stove after figuring out how to work the flue, and attacked the mountain of dishes. She scrubbed the stove, the counters, the floor. As she worked, she could see Colt Maddox through the grimy kitchen window. He moved with a relentless, solitary rhythm. He mended a section of fence, his movements economical and precise. He worked with his horse, not with gentle words, but with a firm hand and a low, commanding tone. There was no wasted motion, no moment of rest. He was like a machine built of sinew and bone, a man at war with the endless list of tasks his ranch demanded of him. He was a ghost haunting his own property, a silent, grim specter of unending labor. She saw him stop once, leaning against a fence post to wipe the sweat from his brow with his forearm. And even in that moment of rest, he looked coiled, tense, like a wolf that could never allow itself to be at ease. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes, she cooked. There wasn't much to work with: some dried beans, salted pork, flour, coffee, but she made a simple, hearty meal of bean and bacon stew with a fresh batch of biscuits from the oven. The smell of baking bread filled the dusty house, a warm, comforting scent that felt alien in this place. He came in as darkness fell, bringing the chill of the evening with him. He didn't say a word, just moved to the basin where she'd left fresh water and washed his hands and face, the splashing sound echoing in the quiet room. He sat at the table, and she served him a bowl of stew and a plate of biscuits. She took a smaller portion for herself and sat at the far end of the table, as far from him as she could get. They ate in a silence broken only by the scrape of spoons against earthenware and the chirping of crickets outside. The stew was good. She knew it was, but he gave no sign of approval. He simply ate, his eyes fixed on his bowl, his entire being focused on the task of refueling his body. When he was finished, he pushed the bowl away, drank his coffee in 3 long gulps, and stood up. "There's wood for the stove in the lean-to out back," he said, his voice as devoid of warmth as it had been that afternoon. Then he was gone, disappearing into another part of the house. Elena stayed in the kitchen, the silence pressing in on her again, heavier than before. She cleaned up after their meal, the methodical work a comfort. The house was still. She assumed he had gone to bed, but as the hours crept by, deep into the night, she knew she wouldn't be able to sleep. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was a whirlwind. She decided to make one last trip to the woodpile in the lean-to, to make sure she was ready for the morning. Stepping outside, the night air was cool and crisp. 1,000,000 stars were scattered across the black velvet sky, more than she had ever seen. They looked cold and impossibly distant. As she rounded the corner of the house, a faint sliver of light caught her eye. It was coming from under the door of a small shed set off from the main barn. And then she heard it, a low sound, a sharp intake of breath, quickly stifled, as if someone was trying to swallow a cry of pain. Her first instinct was to retreat, to go back to the safety of the kitchen. This was not her business. He had drawn the line between them as clearly as a barbed wire fence, but a deeper, more human instinct, curiosity, or perhaps a flicker of something kinder, pulled her forward. She moved silently, her worn boots making no sound on the packed earth. The shed door was warped and didn't hang straight, leaving a small gap. She peered through the crack. The scene inside was lit by a single, flickering lantern. Colt was there, his back to her. He was stripped to the waist, his scarred back muscles taut. The lantern light cast deep shadows across his skin. On a crate beside him lay a wicked-looking knife, its blade gleaming, and a bottle of whiskey. But it was what he was doing that made her breath catch in her throat. In his right hand, he held a crude needle and a piece of what looked like thick, waxed thread. His left arm was held stiffly at his side, and she could see a long, dark gash running along his forearm, deep and angry-looking. Blood welled up, black in the lamplight. With a hand that was shockingly steady, he was stitching the wound himself, pulling the rough thread through his own flesh with a grim, focused patience. He didn't flinch, but she saw his whole body tense with each pull of the needle. She must have made a sound, a tiny gasp, or perhaps a floorboard inside the shed betrayed her. His head snapped up. In an instant, he whipped around, his eyes finding the crack in the door, finding her. They were no longer the cold, stormy gray she had seen that afternoon. They were wild, feral, the eyes of a cornered animal. A low snarl rumbled in his chest. "Get out!" he bit out, the words a blade meant to wound. "Get away from here!" Elena stumbled back, her heart pounding against her ribs. She turned to flee, but not before she saw it. For just a fraction of a second, before the mask of fury slammed back down. His eyes held something else. It wasn't just the raw, physical agony of the needle in his skin. It was something deeper, a flash of profound, desperate loneliness, an old, deep-seated pain that had nothing to do with the bleeding gash on his arm. She retreated into the dark house, her hands shaking. The image was seared into her mind, the solitary man, tending to his own wounds in the dead of night, trusting no one, needing no one. She finally understood. The wall he had built around himself wasn't just to keep others out. It was to keep his own broken pieces from falling apart. She was living not with a cruel man, but with a man in constant, silent agony. And that, she realized, was a far more dangerous thing. Sleep did not come easily to Elena that first night. When it finally did, it was a shallow, restless thing, haunted by the image of a man's silhouette against lantern light, pulling a needle and thread through his own skin. The memory was a sharp stone in her mind, and she turned it over and over, feeling its jagged edges. The anger in his eyes when he discovered her had been terrifying, but it was the flash of raw, unguarded pain beneath it that had truly shaken her. It was a look she recognized, a cousin to the desolation she had often seen in her own reflection. She rose before the first hint of dawn, while the sky was still a deep, star-pricked indigo. The house was cold and utterly silent, holding its breath in the pre-dawn gloom. She moved without a sound, dressing in the dark and slipping into the kitchen. The silence in this house was different from the silence of the plains. Out there, it was a vast, natural emptiness. In here, it was a deliberate, constructed thing, a heavy blanket woven from one man's solitude and suspicion. Yesterday, the kitchen had been a challenge. Today, she saw it as an opportunity. It was a space of chaos and neglect, a territory she could claim and conquer with her own two hands. The work would be hard, but it was simple, honest work. It would keep her mind from dwelling on the man in the other room, and from straying back to the life she had fled. She began with the stove, with the quiet efficiency of someone long accustomed to such tasks. She cleared the old ashes, laid new kindling, and soon had a small, steady fire going. The warmth began to push back against the chill of the room, a small victory in itself. As water heated in a large kettle, she surveyed her domain. The dishes in the basin were a monument to indifference, caked with the hardened remains of solitary meals. The countertops were dull with a film of grease and dust. The floor was a map of muddy boot prints. She tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and began. Outside on the porch, Colt Maddox sat in a high-backed wooden chair, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. He had been awake for an hour, listening. He was a light sleeper, a habit born from years of living alone where any unusual sound could mean trouble, a predator in the chicken coop, a stray spark from the fire, or something worse. He had heard her rise, the soft tread of her bare feet on the wooden floors, the quiet clink of the stove lid. And now, the sounds from his kitchen were a steady, rhythmic assault on the silence he had so carefully cultivated. The splash of water, the determined scrape of a knife against a plate, the soft thud of a cupboard door. Each sound was an intrusion, a reminder of the foreign presence he had allowed into his sanctuary. He took a long drink of the scalding coffee, the bitterness a familiar comfort. He was annoyed. He told himself it was the noise, the disruption to his morning ritual. But it was more than that. He was unsettled by the memory of the previous night. Her face, pale in the sliver of light from the shed, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else he couldn't or wouldn't name. She had seen him at his most vulnerable, in a moment where he was forced to confront the physical consequences of his own harsh life. He had spent years building a wall of self-sufficiency so high and thick that no one could breach it, and in a single, careless moment, she had peered over the top. The image of her, standing there in the dark, made his gut twist. He hated pity. He hated the soft, cloying sympathy some people, especially women, offered up like a cheap tonic. He had learned the hard way that such things were fleeting, that they were always followed by expectations he couldn't meet, demands he wouldn't abide. A woman he'd once known, years ago, had cried over a scar on his hand. She'd promised to stay, to soften the rough edges of his life. She had lasted until the first winter, until the work got hard and the loneliness set in. Then she had left, taking his savings and what little trust he had left with her. He would not make that mistake again. This one, Elena, was no different. She was just another stray, battered by the world, looking for a temporary refuge. He had given her one, on his terms. Work for shelter, a simple, clean transaction. He would not allow it to become anything more. He looked down at his left forearm, now tightly wrapped with a strip of clean linen. The arm throbbed with a dull, insistent pain, but he ignored it. Pain was a constant companion, as familiar as the sun and the wind. He forced his attention back to the sounds from the kitchen. The scraping had been replaced by a softer, rhythmic sloshing. Then the clink of clean dishes being stacked. He had expected her to be slow, perhaps even reluctant. He had expected her to do the bare minimum, just enough to earn her keep. But this was different. There was a relentless, methodical energy to her work that grated on him. It was a quiet reproach to the state he had let his home fall into. He scowled into his coffee mug. He didn't care about the dust. He didn't care about the dirty dishes. The house was a tool, a shelter from the elements. Nothing more. He lived his life outside, on the back of his horse, under the wide, unforgiving sky. But as the sun climbed higher, casting a long shadow from the porch rail, he found he could not leave. He sat there, a silent sentinel, listening, his hands wrapped around the warm mug, as if to ward off a chill that came from within. His eyes, narrowed against the morning glare, were fixed on the kitchen window, tracking the shadow of her movements within. Inside, Elena worked as if in a trance. Her world had shrunk to the task at hand. The lye soap, the hot water, the stiff bristles of the brush. Each plate scrubbed clean was a small triumph. Each cup and bowl, stacked and shining on the freshly wiped shelf, was a piece of order brought forth from chaos. She worked with a focused intensity, her movements sure and economical. There was a comfort in the simple, repetitive motions. They were a balm to her frayed nerves, a way to anchor herself in the present moment. As she worked, she thought. She thought about the man on the porch. His rage in the shed had been the predictable anger of a private man discovered, but the wound, and the fact that he was tending to it himself, with such grim determination, spoke of a loneliness so profound it made her own feel small by comparison. He had warned her not to expect anything from him, but his actions had told her more than his words ever could. Colt Maddox was a man walled up inside himself, a fortress with a single, wounded inhabitant. She was not afraid of him, not in the way she had been afraid of the man she'd left. That had been a fear of unpredictable tempers, of a kindness that could curdle into cruelty in the blink of an eye. Colt's harshness was different. It was consistent, solid, like a rock. You knew where you stood with him. You knew not to get too close, lest you scrape yourself on his rough edges. In a strange way, there was a kind of safety in that. By mid-morning, the kitchen was transformed. The mountain of dishes was gone, replaced by neat, orderly stacks in the cupboards. The stove gleamed, its black iron surface clean and seasoned. The wooden countertops, scrubbed free of years of grime, showed the warm grain of the wood beneath. She had even tackled the window, scraping away the dirt until the morning sunlight could stream in, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The room smelled of soap and clean wood and the faint, lingering scent of coffee. It was beginning to feel like a livable space. She was wiping down the last of the shelves when his shadow fell across the doorway. She froze, her hand still holding the damp rag. Colt stood there, his empty coffee mug in his hand. He didn't step inside, but filled the frame, his broad shoulders blocking out the light. His eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in every change. He saw the gleaming stove, the clear countertops, the sunlight glinting off the clean window pane. He saw the order, the cleanliness, the undeniable mark of her presence. His face was a mask of stone, impossible to read. His gaze moved from the transformed room to her. He looked at her hands, red and raw from the harsh soap and hot water, and then at her face, smudged with a bit of soot near her temple. She met his gaze directly, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs, bracing herself for a sharp word, a criticism, a reminder of her place. He said nothing. For a long, stretched-out moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire in the stove and the distant lowing of a cow. He looked around the room one more time, his jaw tight. Then, his eyes flicked back to her. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of thanks or approval. It was a stark, reluctant acknowledgement of a fact. He turned without a word and walked back out onto the porch. Elena let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her shoulders slumped. She looked around the clean, bright kitchen. It was hers now. She had done more than just clean a room. She had carved out a small piece of territory in this harsh, silent world. She had established her value not with words, but with work. She knew this was only the beginning. The silence between them remained, but its quality had changed. It was no longer the dead silence of neglect. It was the watchful, expectant silence of two wounded animals sharing a den, each acutely aware of the other's presence, each waiting to see what the other would do next. The real work, she suspected, had just begun. The days at Broken Mesa Ranch began to settle into a spare, unyielding rhythm, governed by the rising and setting of the sun. It was a rhythm built on silence and separate, parallel paths. Elena's world was the house and the small, neglected vegetable patch behind it, which she began to patiently reclaim from the weeds. Colt's world was the vast expanse of land that stretched to the horizon, a domain of cattle, fences, and endless, back-breaking labor. They were like two planets held in the same stark orbit, acknowledging each other's presence with a gravitational pull of silent awareness, but never crossing paths unless necessity demanded it. The silence between them was no longer the hostile, challenging thing it had been on her first day. It had become a known quantity, a feature of the landscape. It was in the way he would leave a pail of fresh milk on the back step without a word, and in the way she would have a hot meal waiting on the table when he returned, long after dusk, smelling of dust and sweat. It was a partnership of necessity, stripped of all pleasantry, yet functional in its own grim way. It was on the third day that she met the ranch's only other inhabitant. He was an old man, his back bent into a permanent question mark from a lifetime of hard work. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes, a surprisingly bright blue, held a gentle, weary wisdom. He had tipped his dusty hat to her as he emerged from the barn. "Mornin', ma'am," he'd said, his voice a dry, friendly rasp. "Jed Carter. I help Mr. Maddox with the stock." Elena had simply nodded, unused to even this small courtesy. Jed didn't press for conversation. He seemed to understand that words were a carefully rationed currency at this ranch. From then on, his presence was a quiet, steady counterpoint to Colt's volatile energy. He would offer a soft-spoken comment on the weather, or a quiet, mighty fine smell coming from that kitchen as he passed by. Each small offering was a crack of light in the otherwise shuttered world of the ranch. He was a part of the place, as old and weathered as the barn itself, and he moved with a slow, deliberate pace that suggested he was in no hurry to get anywhere but where he was. The incident happened a week after her arrival. The morning was bright and clear, the heat already beginning to build. Elena was at the well, her task to haul enough water for the kitchen and to fill the large trough near the corral. The work was physically demanding, more so than any she had done before. The heavy wooden bucket, slick with moss and age, seemed to fight her with every foot of rope she pulled, hand over hand. She had developed a rhythm for it. Brace her feet, lean back with her whole body, pull, coil the rope, and repeat. Her arms, unused to such strain, ached with a deep, burning fatigue. She was on her fourth bucket, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Her dress, the same faded calico, was damp with sweat at the small of her back and under her arms. Colt was nearby, in the open-sided shed where he mended his tack. He was working on a broken bridle, his back mostly to her, but she was always aware of his presence. He was a storm cloud on the edge of her vision, a concentration of intense, brooding energy that she could feel even when she wasn't looking. Jed was on the far side of the corral, patiently replacing a rotted fence post, his movements slow and methodical. Elena gritted her teeth and gave a final, powerful heave to get the full bucket up over the stone lip of the well. It was in that moment of maximum exertion, as she leaned forward to steady the bucket's sloshing weight, that the worn fabric of her right sleeve, already loose from her constant work, slid down her arm. It didn't just slip to her wrist, it fell all the way past her elbow, exposing the pale, tender skin of her inner arm to the morning sun. And to anyone who was looking, there, on the delicate skin, was a faint but undeniable constellation of old bruises. They were ugly shadows, a mosaic of faded yellow and a sickly, lingering purple, clustered in a way that suggested the cruel grip of a hand that had held her too tightly, a thumb that had pressed too hard. They were the ghosts of a past she was trying to outrun, the secret map of her pain. In the shed, the rhythmic scrape of Colt's knife against leather stopped. The sudden silence was as loud as a gunshot. Elena didn't notice at first. Her entire focus was on the heavy, unwieldy bucket. But then she felt the uncanny sensation of being watched, a prickling on her skin that had nothing to do with the sun. She felt the cool air on her bare arm and glanced down. Her heart gave a violent lurch. With a small, sharp gasp, she dropped the rope she was coiling and yanked the sleeve back down, her movements furtive and panicked, like a startled bird. A hot tide of shame washed up her neck, burning her cheeks. She kept her head bowed, her hair falling like a curtain to hide her face, and fumbled for the bucket's handle, her hands suddenly trembling. She didn't look up, but she knew. She knew he had seen. Colt stood frozen for a single, stretched-out beat of time. His eyes, which had flicked over at the sound of her grunt of effort, were fixed on her arm. The stony, impassive mask he wore every day cracked. It was just for an instant, a hairline fracture. But in that moment, his expression was not one of anger or irritation. It was a raw, stark stillness, a look of profound shock that was quickly followed by something else, a dark, familiar anger that seemed to rise from a deep and bitter well within him. He had seen marks like that before, in other places, on other people. It was the world's casual ugliness, an echo of a violence he knew all too well, and its appearance in his own yard, on this quiet, unassuming woman, felt like a personal violation. His recovery was immediate and brutal. He shoved the bridle he was holding onto a hook with such force that the wood groaned. He turned away from her, a harsh, guttural sound of disgust rumbling in his chest, and kicked a loose bucket of nails, sending them skittering across the packed dirt with a deafening clatter. "Are you going to stand there all day?" he snarled, his voice a lash of cold fury. He didn't look at her, but aimed his words at the barn wall. That trough won't fill itself. The sheer, unwarranted harshness of his tone was a shield, a wall of aggression thrown up to hide the crack in his own armor. He was not angry at her. He was angry at the world that had put those marks on her, and angry at himself for the unwelcome jolt of something that had shot through him when he saw them. Across the corral, Jed had also seen. He had been tamping down the earth around the new post when he'd looked up. His movement slowed to a halt. Unlike Colt, there was no shock or anger in his expression. His weathered face simply softened with a deep and profound sadness. He had lived a long time and seen the many ways people could hurt one another. His kind. Blue eyes rested on Elena for a moment, not with pity, but with a gentle, aching understanding. He saw her frantic effort to cover herself, the shame that bowed her head. He caught her eye for the briefest of seconds and gave a slow, almost imperceptible dip of his head, a gesture that conveyed a world of sympathy, before he turned his attention back to the fence post, granting her the dignity of her privacy. Elena finally managed to get a grip on the heavy bucket. She hauled it over to the trough, her arms shaking so badly that water sloshed over the sides, darkening the dust around her boots. She didn't dare look at either man. The open, sunlit space of the yard now felt as small and confining as a locked room. The silence that descended was thick and suffocating, charged with the ugly, unspoken secret that now lay between them. Colt strode out of the shed, grabbed an axe, and began to attack a pile of wood with a savage, violent energy. The rhythmic thud of the blade splitting logs echoing the frantic beating of Elena's heart. Each swing was a testament to the rage and confusion churning within him. He was trying to exorcise the image from his mind, but it was burned there, a permanent brand, a woman's arm, faded bruises in the shape of a man's grip. He kept working, his muscles screaming in protest, until sweat dripped from his brow and his anger had cooled to a hard, cold knot in his stomach. He hated it. He hated that he knew. He had hired a cook, a pair of hands. He had not signed on for this, for the messy, complicated darkness of another person's life. He had built this ranch, this solitary existence, as a fortress against exactly this kind of trouble. And now it was inside the walls, living in his kitchen, sleeping under his roof. For the rest of the day, a fragile truce of avoidance was declared. Elena made herself small, keeping to the house, her movements quiet and ghost-like. Colt stayed out on the range, pushing himself and his horse to the point of exhaustion, as if he could outrun the image that was stuck in his mind. When he finally returned to the house that evening, the usual meal was waiting on the table, but Elena was nowhere to be seen. He ate alone in the silent kitchen, the food tasteless in his mouth. The image of her arm kept replaying in his mind. It was a splinter, lodged deep, and every attempt to ignore it only made it dig in deeper. It was not his problem, he told himself again and again. She was just the cook, but the words rang hollow in the crushing silence of his home. Something had shifted, irrevocably. A piece of her story was now a piece of his, whether he wanted it or not, and the knowledge of it sat between them, a silent, brooding ghost. The days that followed the incident at the well were the quietest yet. The silence in the house thickened, changing from a state of mutual avoidance to a fragile, brittle thing, like a thin sheet of ice over deep water. Elena moved with a careful, measured grace, making herself smaller, her footsteps lighter, as if to avoid cracking that surface. Colt was a storm cloud that never broke, a brooding presence that seemed to fill the very air with a low-pressure dread. He spent even more time away from the house, riding out at dawn and returning after dark, his face set in a grim mask of exhaustion. The image of her bruised arm had become a ghost that haunted the space between them. For Elena, it was a specter of shame, a constant reminder of the past she could not erase. For Colt, it was an unwelcome splinter, a piece of the world's ugliness that had lodged itself in his carefully constructed solitude. He found himself watching her, not with the cold suspicion of before, but with a new, grudging awareness. He saw the way she never wasted emotion, the quiet strength in her hands as she kneaded dough, the unwavering patience with which she tended the nascent rows of vegetables in her garden. He saw a resilience that annoyed and intrigued him in equal measure. He had mistaken her quietness for fragility, and he was beginning to understand he had been wrong. This new tension manifested in small, unspoken ways. One afternoon, Elena was in her garden, her hands raw from pulling at the stubborn, deep-rooted weeds. The cheap cotton gloves she owned had long since given up, their fingers worn through, offering little protection. She worked until her palms were scraped and sore, then went inside to wash the dirt from the stinging cuts. The next morning, when she went out to the back step, a new pair of gloves was sitting on the weathered wood. They were made of thick, supple leather, stitched with strong, even thread, the kind of quality work a man who depended on his hands would choose for himself. There was no note, no explanation. There didn't need to be. She knew who had left them. She slipped her hands inside. They were stiff and new, smelling of tanned hide and oil. They were a shield, a silent, practical, and utterly impersonal gesture. She said nothing to him. Acknowledging the gift would have required a conversation they were both unwilling to have. It would have meant admitting he had noticed her discomfort, that he had cared enough to act. Instead, she offered her own silent reply. That evening, alongside his usual plate of food, she placed a small crock of the wild berry jam she had painstakingly made, its deep purple color a jewel against the plain earthenware. He took it without a word, his expression unreadable. But the next morning, the crock was back on the kitchen counter, empty and washed clean. A fragile, unspoken language was developing between them, a barter system of quiet actions, leather gloves for berry jam, a mended latch on the smokehouse door for a perfectly baked loaf of bread left to cool on the windowsill. They were two strangers, circling each other with wary caution, their only communication these small, anonymous offerings that spoke of a grudging, mutual respect. The trip to town was a necessity they could no longer avoid. The flour sack was nearly empty. The coffee beans were running low, and they were out of salt. Colt announced it one evening, his voice gruff as he stood in the kitchen doorway. "We're going to town in the morning," he said, not looking at her. "For supplies. You'll need to come, to pick out what you need for the kitchen." The thought of it sent a knot of anxiety tightening in Elena's stomach. A trip to town meant leaving the isolated safety of the ranch. It meant people, noise, and stares. And it meant being confined in the small space of a wagon box with Colt for hours. The ride the next morning was as silent and tense as she had feared. They sat on the hard wooden bench of the buckboard wagon, a respectable distance between them, the vast, empty prairie rolling by on all sides. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves, and the sigh of the wind. Elena kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Colt stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his hands firm on the reins. The silence was an active presence, a third passenger in the wagon, filled with everything they had never said to each other. He was acutely aware of the woman beside him, of the faint, clean scent of lye soap and rosemary that clung to her. She was acutely aware of him, of the solid, intimidating bulk of his shoulders, of the tightly controlled energy that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a stove. The town, when they finally reached it, was a shock to the system. It was little more than a single dusty street lined with a dozen or so wooden buildings. But after the profound quiet of the ranch, the noise felt like a physical assault. Men shouted to one another. Hammers rang from the blacksmith's forge, and the tinny, cheerful sound of a piano spilled from the saloon's bat-wing doors. Even though it was barely mid-morning, Colt pulled the wagon up in front of the general store, a long building with a wide porch. "Get what you need," he ordered, his voice tight. "Write it on Mr. Henderson's slate. I'll settle up when I'm done at the freight office." He jumped down and began unhitching the horses without a backward glance. Elena slid down from the wagon, her legs stiff. She smoothed her dress and took a deep breath, steeling herself before she stepped into the store. The interior was dim and cool, smelling of coffee beans, leather, and pickles from a large barrel in the corner. An old man with a long white apron, presumably Mr. Henderson, gave her a polite nod from behind the counter. She moved through the aisles, her mind focused on her list. trying to ignore the few other customers who cast curious glances her way. She had just finished gathering her items: flour, salt, sugar, beans, and was explaining to Mr. Henderson that Colt would be in to pay, when the saloon doors across the street swung open, disgorging a trio of men. They were rough-looking, their faces unshaven, their clothes stained with dirt and sweat. They were laughing loudly, swaggering with the false bravado that came from cheap whiskey. As they crossed the street, their eyes landed on the store, and through the wide-open door, they saw Elena. One of them nudged the other, a sly grin spreading across his face. "Well, looky here, boys. A new flower bloomin' in the dust." They ambled into the store, bringing the stench of stale alcohol and unwashed bodies with them. Mr. Henderson's welcoming expression vanished, replaced by a wary frown. Elena felt a cold dread seep into her veins. She kept her back to them, pretending to inspect a bolt of cloth, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. "Don't be shy, little lady," the first man said, his voice unpleasantly close behind her. She could feel the heat of his presence, and she flinched. "We don't bite. Much." His companion snickered. "What's a pretty thing like you doing all the way out here?" the second one asked, his eyes roaming over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "You must be awful lonely." "Leave the lady alone. Mr. Henderson said, his voice firm but lacking true authority. "She's with Colt Maddox." The name gave them a moment's pause, but the whiskey had made them bold. Maddox, the first one, scoffed. "He ain't here right now, is he? Old man, just you. And her." He took a step closer, reaching out as if to touch a strand of her hair. Elena recoiled, bumping into the counter, her throat closing with a familiar, paralyzing fear. Her past was suddenly present, a phantom in the room with a leering grin and whiskey on its breath. And then the light from the doorway was blocked. Colt stood there, framed against the bright, dusty street. He had a heavy sack of feed slung over one shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply stopped, his body filling the entrance, and his eyes, those cold, stormy gray eyes, moved from the smirking faces of the men to Elena's pale, frightened one. A silence fell over the store. So sudden and absolute, it was like the world had stopped breathing. The men's grins faltered. Colt slowly lowered the sack of feed to the floor with a heavy thud. He still hadn't spoken. He just looked at the three of them, his gaze moving from one to the next. A flat, dead-eyed stare that held no heat, no anger, just a chilling emptiness. It was a look that promised nothing but swift, merciless violence. It was the look of a man who had long since passed the point of making threats and dealt only in consequences. The leader of the trio swallowed hard, his bravado evaporating like a puddle in the midday sun. He shuffled his feet, suddenly finding the floorboards intensely interesting. We was just leavin'," he stammered, nudging his companions. They practically stumbled over one another in their haste to get out, scurrying past Colt like rats fleeing a hawk. They didn't look back. Colt watched them go, his expression unchanging. Then, his gaze fell on Elena. She was pressed against the counter, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge. He saw the tremor in her hands, the residual fear in her eyes. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his own, a deep, ancient rage before the stony mask slammed back into place. He turned to Mr. Henderson as if nothing had happened. "Put her things on my account," he said, his voice as calm and steady as ever. He shouldered the feed sack and walked out. The ride back to the ranch was shrouded in a silence even more profound than the one on the way there. Elena sat rigidly on the wagon bench, the scene in the store replaying in her mind. He hadn't touched them. He hadn't even spoken to them. He had simply been there. His presence alone had been a weapon, a shield. She had been protected. The feeling was so foreign, so utterly alien, that she didn't know what to do with it. That evening, the routine resumed its familiar course. Dinner was eaten in silence. The dishes were washed. The sun set. But the silence was different now. It was no longer just the absence of words. It was filled with the weight of his unspoken action, an invisible shield that now seemed to encompass the entire ranch. The next morning, Elena woke with the sun. When she went to the back step, she stopped. Sitting next to the usual pail of milk was a small hand axe. It wasn't new, but it was clear it had been meticulously cared for. The wooden handle was worn smooth from use, and the metal head had been newly sharpened, its edge gleaming with a dangerous silver light. She reached out and touched it. The handle was smooth and cool, the blade lethally sharp. It was a tool, a weapon. She looked out toward the barn, where she could hear the faint sounds of Colt starting his morning chores. He had left her a gift. It wasn't an apology for the scare in town, and it certainly wasn't a comfort. It was something else entirely. It was a statement. The world is a dangerous place. Protect yourself. It was the only way he knew how to show he had seen her, that he had understood her fear. It was an offering of strength, a piece of his own self-reliant, hardened world. She picked up the axe, its weight solid and reassuring in her hand. She looked out at the vast, indifferent prairie, then back at the silent house. Something deep inside her, a place that had been frozen with fear for a very long time, began to thaw. It wasn't trust. Not yet. It was something far more fragile, far more tentative. It was the first, faint stirring of hope, the gift of the hand axe, and the unspoken event in town that had prompted it created a subtle but profound shift in the atmosphere at Broken Mesa Ranch. The silence between Elena and Colt remained, but it was no longer a void. It was a space charged with a new, complex awareness. He had protected her. She had accepted that protection. An invisible line had been crossed, and though neither of them knew how to navigate this new territory, they could both feel its altered geography. The days fell back into their rhythm, but the rhythm itself had changed. Elena rose with the first gray light of dawn, but her movements were different now. There was a confidence in her step, a purpose in her hands that hadn't been there before. The small axe Colt had given her became a familiar tool. Each morning, she would spend a few minutes at the woodpile, the clean, sharp thwack of the blade splitting kindling becoming one of the first sounds to break the ranch's morning silence. The sound was a declaration. I am here. I am capable. I am not afraid of the work. Her energy, once focused solely on the kitchen, began to spill out into the rest of the house. She was a quiet, relentless force of transformation. One day, she took down the grimy, sun-bleached curtains that hung like shrouds over the windows. She spent hours scrubbing them in a tub of harsh lye soap and water until the fabric, once a dreary gray, revealed itself to be a simple, cheerful yellow check. When she hung them back up, damp and smelling of sun and soap, they let a clean, filtered light into the main room, chasing the darkest shadows from the corners. Colt came in for his midday meal and stopped dead in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the windows. He blinked, as if the unaccustomed brightness was a physical blow. He looked at the curtains, then at Elena, who was busy at the stove, her back to him. A muscle worked in his jaw. He opened his mouth as if to say something, a protest, a criticism, but no words came. He sat down at the table and ate his meal in a tense, brooding silence. He said nothing, but he saw everything. He saw the way the floors were now swept clean of their perpetual layer of red dust. He saw the jar of hardy wildflowers she had placed in the center of the table, their vibrant purple and yellow, a stark, living contrast to the dull, weathered wood. He found his worn work shirts, once destined for the rag pile, laid on his cot with their rips and tears mended, the stitches small and neat and almost invisible. Each change was a quiet testament to her presence, a gentle but persistent chipping away at the grim neglect he had allowed to settle over the house, and over himself. He told himself it was an annoyance, a disruption of the familiar order of things. He preferred the dim light. He didn't need neatly mended shirts, but his annoyance was a thin, brittle shield against a more complicated feeling. Her tireless work, her patient acts of restoration, felt like a quiet judgment on the way he had been living. And yet, there was no judgment in her eyes, only a steady, focused calm, while Colt remained a figure of gruff, watchful distance. Jed Carter became Elena's anchor to a gentler world. The old ranch hand seemed to possess a deep, intuitive understanding of what she needed. And it was not pity or questions. It was simple, easy companionship. He would find reasons to be near the house when he knew she was outside, working in her garden. He'd lean against the fence, ostensibly checking a loose rail, and talk to her in his low, rambling way. He never asked about her past or where she came from. Instead, he spoke the language of the land. "See that hawk, ma'am," he'd say, pointing a gnarled finger toward the sky. "He's hunting. Means the rattlers will be staying close to their dens today. You watch your step near the woodpile." He told her about the seasons at Broken Mesa, about how the creek ran high in the spring and the north wind in the winter could cut a man in two. He spoke of Colt's father, a man he had worked for 30 years, Old Man Maddox. He was harder than a pine knot, Jed recalled, his eyes looking at something far in the distance. But he knew this land, knew every rock and every draw. This ranch was his whole world. Colt, he's got his father's grit, that's for sure. Jed's words were like small, carefully placed stepping stones, giving her a path into the history of this place, and into the life of the silent, angry man who now owned it. Through Jed, she learned that Colt's mother had been a quiet, gentle woman who had loved flowers, and that the now barren patch of earth she was tending had once been a vibrant garden under her care. One afternoon, as Elena sat on the back step shelling beans into a large bowl, Jed came and sat on a nearby overturned bucket. "Those biscuits you make," he said, looking at his worn boots, "taste just like the ones Mrs. Maddox used to bake. Haven't had biscuits like that in a long time." The simple, unadorned compliment was so unexpected that it brought a lump to Elena's throat. It was a validation, a quiet acknowledgement that her work was seen and appreciated. It was a small kindness, but in the starved landscape of her life, it felt like a feast. She could only nod, unable to speak, and was grateful when he simply changed the subject, pointing out a lizard sunning itself on a rock. Colt saw them sometimes. He'd be riding in from the range, and he'd see the two of them, the old man and the quiet woman, sharing a comfortable silence or a low-voiced conversation near the house. He'd rein in his horse, watching from a distance, a strange, unfamiliar feeling tightening his chest. It was an irritation, he told himself. He was paying Jed to work, not to sit around gossiping, but it was more than that. It was the feeling of being an outsider in his own home. They had built a small, quiet world that did not include him, and the sight of it stirred a possessiveness in him that he didn't know he had. He would spur his horse into motion, his face a thunderous mask as he rode past them toward the barn, offering neither of them a glance. But he couldn't escape the changes. He couldn't escape the image of her bruised arm, an image that had become a permanent resident in the back of his mind. Out on the range, under the vast, empty sky, where a man had nothing but his own thoughts for company, the memory would ambush him. He'd be mending a fence, his hands busy with the wire, and he would see it, that ugly, faded map of another man's cruelty on her pale skin. He'd always considered strength to be a loud, hard thing, the strength to break a wild horse, to endure a winter storm, to face down an enemy without flinching. But Elena's strength was a different thing entirely. It was quiet, enduring, like the grass that somehow managed to grow back after being trampled. She had survived something that would have broken other people, and she had not become hard or bitter. She had simply endured. And now, she was not just surviving. She was creating. She was creating order out of his chaos. light out of his gloom, life out of his neglect. This realization was a constant, low-grade irritant. It chipped away at the certainty of his solitude, at the conviction that he was better off alone. He fought it. He clung to his gruffness like a shield. He would find fault where there was none. His voice sharp when he told her the coffee was too weak, or that she'd used too much wood in the stove. But the words felt hollow even to him. They were the last, desperate defenses of a fortress whose walls were slowly, inexorably being breached, not by force, but by the steady, gentle pressure of a quiet woman's care. One evening, he came back later than usual. A storm had been threatening all afternoon, and he'd been riding hard to move a small herd of cattle to a more sheltered pasture. He was soaked through, exhausted, and in a foul mood. He stomped onto the porch, peeling off his wet coat, expecting to find the house dark and his dinner cold. But a single lamp was burning in the kitchen, casting a warm, golden glow. The room was warm and smelled of stew and fresh bread. His meal was on the table, a plate covered with another to keep it warm. Elena was nowhere to be seen. She had already retired to her room. He had expected to be met with the familiar, empty silence of his house, but instead, he was met with this quiet, thoughtful care. He sat down and ate, the warmth of the stew slowly seeping into his chilled bones. As he finished, his eyes fell on a neatly folded pile of his mended clothes sitting on the corner of the table. On top of the pile was the shirt he had worn the day before, the one with the torn pocket. He picked it up. The pocket had been sewn back on, the stitches so fine and even they were practically invisible. He sat there for a long time, the empty plate before him, the mended shirt in his hands. The storm broke outside, the rain lashing against the window panes, the wind howling around the eaves of the house. But inside, it was quiet. He ran his thumb over the neat stitches, over the evidence of her patient, careful work. He was still a man alone, a solitary island in the vast prairie. But for the first time in years, he could hear the sound of another person's steady, quiet breathing in the next room. And for the first time, the sound was not an intrusion. It was simply a presence. The change was happening. He didn't want it. He hadn't asked for it. But it was happening all the same, as surely and as slowly as the rain was soaking into the thirsty earth outside. A place like Broken Mesa Ranch, set so far from its nearest neighbors, might seem immune to the currents of the world, but solitude is a myth. The world has long tendrils, and none is longer or more insidious than the tendril of gossip. News in that part of the country traveled slowly, carried by circuit riders, freight haulers, and lone horsemen riding from one distant homestead to the next. It was often distorted, whispered over cracker barrels and saloon bars, morphing with each telling until it bore little resemblance to the truth. The truth, in this case, was simple Colt Maddox had hired a cook. But the truth is rarely as interesting as the speculation that surrounds it. In the small, dusty town that served as the region's hub, the news was juicier. Colt Maddox, the recluse, the man who'd turned his back on the world after some unspoken tragedy years ago, had a woman living with him, a strange woman. No one knew where she came from. She had appeared on foot, like a ghost from the prairie. She was quiet, kept to herself, and, according to the men who had seen her in the general store, she had a haunted look in her eyes. The speculation began to smolder. Was she his cousin, his mail-order bride? A woman of ill repute he was hiding from the law, in a community bound by the rigid, unwritten laws of propriety and survival. An unknown element was a threat, and a woman living alone with a man to whom she was not related was a scandal. A tear in the social fabric that had to be inspected, judged, and, if necessary, mended with the sharp needle of public opinion. The self-appointed seamstress of the town's moral fabric was a woman named Martha Turner. She was the wife of the town's blacksmith, a large, sour woman whose piety was as starched and severe as the lace collars she always wore. Even in the blistering heat, Mrs. Turner saw it as her Christian duty to monitor the spiritual health of the community. a task she pursued with the relentless zeal of a hunter tracking a wounded animal. When the whispers about the woman at Broken Mesa reached her ears, she knew what she had to do. Her visit came on a Tuesday, a day so hot and still the air itself seemed to buzz. Elena saw the dust cloud first, a faint plume on the horizon, slowly growing larger, resolving itself into a horse and a rickety black buggy. Visitors were so rare at the ranch that the sight of one filled her with a sense of unease. Jed was out on the range, and Colt was in the barn, mending a broken stall door. Elena was alone in the house. She stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach as the buggy pulled into the yard. "Mrs." Turner drew her horse to a halt with a sharp tug on the reins. She sat enthroned on the buggy seat, a formidable figure in a dark gray dress, a bonnet tied so tightly under her chin it made her face bulge. Her eyes, small and sharp as a bird's, swept over the ranch, taking in the neatened yard, the clean porch, and finally, Elena herself. Her gaze was an inventory, a swift and merciless judgment of Elena's worn dress, her bare arms, and the stray strands of hair that had escaped her bun in the heat. "Good afternoon, Mrs." Turner said, her voice carrying a false, honeyed sweetness that did not reach her eyes. "I was in the area, visiting the sick, and thought I might stop for a cool drink of water. The Lord's work is thirsty work, you know." She did not wait for an invitation, but began the laborious process of climbing down from the buggy. Elena, bound by the ingrained rules of hospitality, could do nothing but murmur, "Of course, please come in." Inside, the house felt small and confining with Mrs. Turner's presence filling it. The woman's eyes darted everywhere, noting the clean floors, the jar of wildflowers on the table, the mended curtains. Her expression was one of mild surprise, as if she had expected to find a den of squalor and was disappointed by the evidence of order and care. Elena brought her a glass of water from the bucket, her hands trembling slightly. She felt like a specimen under glass. "You must be the help, Mrs." Turner said, taking a small, delicate sip of water. The word help was layered with meaning, a polite substitute for a dozen other, less charitable terms. "I am the cook. Yes, ma'am," Elena said, her voice quiet. "It is a great blessing for Mr. Maddox, I am sure, Mrs." Turner continued, her eyes boring into Elena's. "A man alone can let things fall to ruin. It is not good for a man to be alone. The Bible tells us so. Though, of course, proper arrangements are always best." She let the phrase hang in the air, a baited hook. Elena said nothing, her gaze fixed on the floor. She could feel the woman's probing stare, trying to pry open the locks of her past. "And where is your family from, dear Mrs.?" Turner asked, her tone shifting to one of condescending intimacy. "I have no family," Elena answered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Oh, you poor thing, Mrs." Turner clucked, though there was no sympathy in her voice, only the satisfaction of a salacious detail confirmed. All alone in the world. It must be so difficult. A young woman, unprotected. It does invite trouble, doesn't it? At that moment, a shadow fell across the doorway. Colt stood there, silent and menacing. He had come from the barn, drawn by the unfamiliar sight of the buggy. He held a heavy hammer in one hand, and his face was a thunderous mask of displeasure. He looked at Mrs. Turner, then at Elena's bowed head and hunched shoulders, and he understood immediately what was happening. This was not a social call. It was an interrogation, an invasion. "Mrs. Turner," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a greeting. It was a dismissal. The woman was momentarily startled, but she recovered quickly, her sweet smile snapping back into place. "Mr. Maddox, I was just enjoying a glass of water with your cook. We were having a lovely chat." Colt said nothing. He simply stood there, His presence an unmovable wall of hostility. His silence was more intimidating than any shout could have been. He did not invite her to stay. He did not ask after her health or her husband. He simply waited. "Mrs." Turner's smile faltered under the weight of his stare. She was used to people being cowed by her moral authority, and this silent, implacable resistance unnerved her. She drained her glass and stood up, smoothing the front of her dress. "Well, I must be on my way," she said, her voice losing some of its sweetness. "The sick cannot wait." She moved toward the door, pausing as she passed Colt. She looked him up and down, a flicker of disdain in her eyes. "A man in your position must be careful. Mr. Maddox, people will talk. It is important to avoid the appearance of sin, even if the heart is pure." With that final, parting shot, she swept out of the house and climbed back into her buggy. Colt watched until the buggy was nothing more than a dust cloud on the horizon before he finally moved. He turned and looked at Elena. She hadn't moved. She was still standing by the table, her head bowed, her arms wrapped around her waist as if she were holding herself together. He saw her shoulders. They were trembling, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, but it was there. The sight of it sent a hot, violent surge of rage through him, so powerful it made his hand tighten on the hammer until his knuckles were white. He wanted to smash something. He wanted to ride into town and drag that venomous old woman from her house and tell her to mind her own damn business. He wanted to say something to Elena, something to undo the damage, but the words wouldn't come. He had no language for comfort. The only language he knew was anger and silence. So he chose silence. He turned without a word, walked out of the house, and went back to the barn, where he proceeded to hammer a perfectly good stall door with a fury that made the entire structure shake. Elena remained in the kitchen, the echo of Mrs. Turner's words ringing in her ears. A young woman, unprotected. It does invite trouble. The appearance of sin. The woman had seen right through her. She had seen the shame, the stain of her past, and had named it. Elena felt dirty, exposed. She had thought, foolishly, that she could escape her history here, in this isolated place. But Mrs. Turner had shown her that a reputation, once sullied, follows you like a shadow. Worse, she had brought that shadow to Colt's door. She was the strange woman, the source of gossip, the appearance of sin in his house, the fragile peace she had found, the sense of purpose in her work. All of it crumbled into dust. She was a liability, a blight on this man who had, in his own gruff way, offered her a sanctuary. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. That evening, the silence at the dinner table was heavier than ever before. Elena could not bring herself to look at Colt. She served the food and retreated to the far side of the room, her plate untouched. She expected him to say something, to tell her she had to leave, that she was more trouble than she was worth. But he ate his meal with his usual grim focus and then left without a word. Later, long after the house had grown dark, Elena saw the faint orange glow of his pipe from the porch. She watched him through the kitchen window, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. Colt stood leaning against a porch post, the familiar ritual of smoking doing little to soothe the anger coiling in his gut. He wasn't just angry at Mrs. Turner. He was angry at the whole damn world, a world that was so quick to judge, so eager to whisper and condemn. They looked at him and saw a recluse, a hard man, and they judged him without knowing a thing about the grief that had hollowed him out. They looked at Elena and saw a strange woman, and they branded her a sinner without knowing a single thing about the quiet strength he saw every day, the resilience that had allowed her to survive whatever hell she had come from. He took a long draw from his pipe, the smoke a bitter taste on his tongue. He had built this ranch to be a fortress against that world, against its petty cruelties and its hypocritical judgments. He had thought the walls were high enough, but the world had sent an emissary in a black buggy to breach his defenses and wound the one person he had allowed inside. He looked back toward the dark kitchen window. knowing she was somewhere in the shadows, probably feeling the sting of that old woman's venom. The thought made the anger in his chest burn hotter. In that moment, he realized that Mrs. Turner's visit hadn't driven them apart. It had done the opposite. It had drawn a line in the dust. On one side was the whispering, judgmental world. And on the other side was Broken Mesa Ranch. On the other side was him. And her. He didn't know what that meant, but as he stared out into the vast, dark prairie, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would not let that world hurt her again. The afternoon was dying a slow, violent death. The sun, a molten coin, bled across the western horizon, staining the undersides of the low-hanging clouds in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. A restless wind had kicked up, hot and dry, carrying the scent of distant rain and the taste of dust. It was the kind of weather that frayed a man's nerves, a prelude to a storm that might or might not break. For Colt Maddox, the storm had already arrived. He'd spent the better part of the day miles from the ranch, tracking a half-dozen steers that had found a break in the far northern fence line. It was a miserable, thankless job. The cattle were spooked and stubborn. The terrain was rocky and treacherous, and the relentless sun had beaten down on him until his head throbbed and his shirt was a stiff, salty second skin. By the time he and Jed had finally hazed the last of the strays back through the gap and temporarily patched the fence with loose wire and prayer, his patience had been worn down to a single, raw nerve. The ride home was long and silent, each jarring step of his tired horse a fresh irritation. The broken fence was more than just another chore. It was a violation. It was a sign of the constant, unending battle against decay, against the relentless forces of nature and bad luck that were always trying to tear down what a man had built. He had poured his life into this ranch, his sweat and blood and what was left of his soul. He had built his fences high and strong, not just to keep his cattle in, but to keep the world out. And the world, it seemed, was always finding new ways to break through. He was in a foul humor, a black mood that had been simmering all day and was now threatening to boil over. He was bone-weary, his muscles screaming in protest, and a deep, familiar anger was coiling in his gut. It was an anger at the contrary cattle, at the broken fence, at the unforgiving sun, at a world that gave a man no peace. It was an anger looking for a place to land. As he rode into the yard, he saw Elena. She was by the side of the house, using the hand axe he had given her to chop a fallen cottonwood branch into smaller, manageable pieces for the kitchen stove. She worked with a steady, focused rhythm, the clean thwack of the axe a small, defiant sound against the rising moan of the wind. In another mood, he might have noted the unexpected strength in her slender arms, the quiet determination in the set of her shoulders. But today, all he saw was another disruption, another moving part in a world that was already too complicated. He swung down from his horse, his body stiff and aching. He didn't want to go into the house. He didn't want to face the quiet order she had created, the silent reproach of her neatness and her wildflowers. He wanted to find a bottle of whiskey and drink until the raw edges of the day were blurred and dull. "Jed," he grunted, handing the reins to the old man. "See to the horse." Without another word, he strode toward the house, his boots kicking up dust, his spurs jingling in angry rhythm. He burst through the kitchen door like a blast of the hot wind outside. Elena had just come in and was at the water basin, pouring water to wash the grime from her hands. She turned, startled by his sudden, violent entrance. "The north fence is down," he snarled, the words tearing out of him, sharp and ragged. He wasn't even talking to her, just venting the pressure that had built up inside him all day. 6 steers, almost lost them in the Badlands. A whole damn day wasted because something is always breaking, always falling apart. He paced the length of the small kitchen, a caged animal. Is it too much to ask for one day where things just work? One day where I don't have to fix something some fool broke or mend a fence some animal knocked down? Elena stood by the basin, silent and still, her hands hovering over the water. She had learned to recognize the weather of his moods. She knew this storm was not about her, but she also knew she was the only other person in the room, the only available lightning rod. She kept her eyes downcast, waiting for it to pass. But her silence, which he usually found tolerable, was today a fresh irritant. It felt like a judgment, a placid wall against which his own rage was uselessly breaking. "What are you standing there for?" he snapped, his voice rising. He whirled on her, his frustration finally finding its target. "Is dinner going to cook itself? I've been in the saddle for 10 hours. I'm tired and I'm hungry, and I come back to you just standing there, staring at the water." The injustice of the accusation, the sheer raw unfairness of it, made her flinch. She had been working since dawn, just as he had. But she didn't argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with a man in this state was like trying to reason with a wildfire. She turned to move toward the stove, a quiet, instinctual retreat. It was that simple movement, a turn of her shoulders, a slight raising of her arm as she reached for a pot. That did it. The late-day sun, now a fiery sliver on the horizon, slanted through the clean kitchen window in a single, dramatic shaft of light. It caught her as she moved. The loose sleeve of her dress, the one she was always so careful to keep in place, slid down her arm. It didn't just slide to her wrist. It fell away completely, pooling around her elbow, and the shaft of golden, unforgiving light illuminated her arm from wrist to bicep. Colt froze. The angry words died in his throat, choked off by a sudden, violent intake of breath. The world seemed to slow, the motes of dust dancing in the sunbeam hanging suspended in the air. It wasn't just the old, faded bruises he had seen before. Those were still there, faint yellow and green ghosts under her skin. But among them, stark and ugly in the warm light, were others. One in particular, high on her arm, was a deep, angry, vicious purple, the edges already beginning to bloom into a sickly blue. It was not an old mark. It was newer, fresher, a testament to a more recent and more violent trauma from the life she had escaped. The pattern was horrifyingly clear, the distinct, brutal imprint of fingers and a thumb, a map of cruelty that had been pressed into her flesh. The sight was a physical blow. It knocked the air from his lungs, the anger from his soul. In the space of a single heartbeat, the roaring fire of his rage was extinguished, doused by a tidal wave of ice-cold shame. The petty frustrations of his day, the broken fence, the stubborn cattle shriveled into pathetic, insignificant nothings in the face of this silent, terrible evidence of real suffering. He looked from her arm to his own clenched fists, and a wave of self-loathing so powerful it made him feel sick washed over him. He had been yelling at her. He had been storming around his kitchen, full of his own self-pity and anger, directing it all at this woman who had survived something he couldn't even begin to imagine. He felt like the lowest, foulest creature on the earth. Elena had frozen too, her arm outstretched, exposed. She stood paralyzed in the shaft of light, pinned by his horrified gaze. She felt a cold dread that was worse than fear. Her secret, the one she had guarded so carefully, the physical proof of her shame, was laid bare. Then, with a small, sharp gasp, she seemed to fold in on herself. She snatched her arm back, pulling the sleeve down with a frantic, desperate gesture, hugging the arm to her body as if to hide it from the world, from him, from herself. She couldn't look at him. She kept her head bowed, her hair hiding her face, her whole body trembling. The silence in the room was a deafening roar. Colt wanted to speak, to apologize, to say something, anything, to erase the last 5 minutes, to erase the ugly, brutish way he had behaved. But his throat was locked. What could he possibly say? The chasm that had just opened up between them was too wide for words to cross. Elena finally broke the silence. Her voice was a bare whisper. a fragile, threadbare sound that was nearly lost in the moan of the wind outside. I'll finish dinner." It was a retreat, a desperate grasp for the one thing that made sense, the one role that offered her a shield. She turned her back on him and moved to the stove, her movements stiff and jerky. The sight of her small, trembling back, of her trying to carry on as if nothing had happened, was more than he could bear. The air in the kitchen was thick, unbreathable, choked with his shame and her pain. He had to get out. He stumbled backward, bumping into the table. He turned and fled the house, bursting out onto the porch as if escaping a fire. The wind hit him full in the face, a wild, scouring force. It tore at his clothes, whipped his hair across his eyes, and filled his lungs with dust. He barely felt it. He walked to the edge of the porch and gripped the railing, his knuckles white, staring out at the turbulent, bruised sky. The world outside was a perfect reflection of the chaos inside him. He had seen her. For the first time, he had truly seen her, not as a cook, not as a stray, not as a quiet presence in his house, but as a woman who had carried a terrible weight, a woman whose body was a testament to a private war he knew nothing about. And he, in his blind, stupid anger, had just added another wound, not to her body, but to her spirit. The wind howled around him, a long, mournful cry that seemed to come from the very soul of the prairie. It offered no comfort, no absolution. It only echoed the vast, hollow emptiness that had just opened up inside of him. He stood there, alone in the growing dark, as the first drops of the long-overdue storm began to fall like tears from the angry sky. The storm did not arrive gently. It fell out of the sky with the sudden, violent force of an ambush. The first drops of rain, thick and heavy as coins, had quickly given way to a torrential, driving downpour. The wind, no longer a mournful moan, became a physical entity, a shrieking beast that clawed at the walls of the house and rattled the window panes in their frames with a frantic, desperate energy. Colt stood on the porch, unmoving, letting the deluge soak him to the bone. The rain plastered his hair to his scalp and streamed down his face, mingling with the sweat and grime of the day. It was cold, a shocking, cleansing cold, but it did nothing to cool the fire of shame that burned in his gut. Each gust of wind felt like a judgment, each crack of thunder overhead a pronouncement of his guilt. He had fled the kitchen, fled the sight of her pain, but there was no escape. The image of her arm, stark and brutal in that last shaft of sunlight, was seared onto the inside of his eyelids. It was a more profound and lasting brand than any hot iron he had ever held. He saw it with every flash of lightning that lit up the yard in a ghostly, momentary daylight. The pale skin, the dark, ugly marks. The silent testimony of a suffering he had not only failed to see, but had actively added to with his own blind, selfish rage. He stayed out there for a long time, letting the storm wash over him, a pointless penance that cleansed nothing. He was a fool, a cruel, blind fool. He had built this life of solitude to protect himself from the wounds the world could inflict, but he had never considered that he himself could become the one who inflicted them. He had become the very thing he despised, a man who used his strength to hurt someone weaker, who used his anger as a cudgel against a spirit that was already bruised and battered. The lamp in the kitchen window flickered, a tiny, fragile spark of gold against the raging, monochrome chaos of the storm. The sight of it pierced through the fog of his self-loathing. She was in there, alone, in the dark, frightened, and he had put her there. He had caused this. A new fear, sharper and more urgent than his own shame, cut through him. What if she left? The thought was a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. What if she simply walked out into this storm, deciding that the fury of the elements was preferable to the fury of the man inside the house? The idea of this place without her, without the scent of baking bread, without the quiet order she had created, without the steady, silent presence that had slowly, imperceptibly become the anchor of his days, was suddenly unbearable. The silence he had once craved now seemed like a terrifying, hollow abyss. He had to go back. He had to face her. He turned and pushed the door open. Stumbling back into the kitchen, he was a mess, dripping water onto the clean floor, his boots leaving muddy tracks. The room was just as he had imagined. The single oil lamp on the table sputtered and danced in the drafts that snaked through the old house, casting long, distorted shadows that leaped and writhed on the walls. The roar of the storm outside filled the small space, making it feel like the last safe outpost in a world that was tearing itself apart. And then he saw it. On the table, next to the flickering lamp, was her small linen bundle, the one she had been carrying the day she arrived. It was neatly tied. Her thin wool shawl was folded beside it. She was packing. She stood near the cold stove, her back to him. She didn't seem to have heard him enter over the din of the storm. He saw her shoulders, hunched and defeated. He saw her hands, twisting a small, damp cloth over and over. She was preparing to flee. The sight of that pathetic little bundle on his table broke something inside him. All the walls he had built around his heart, all the calloused layers of anger and grief and solitude, they just crumbled. All that was left was a raw, aching core of desperation. "Don't," he said. The word was a croak, a rough, broken thing, barely audible over the wind. But she heard it. Her whole body went rigid. She flinched, as if expecting a blow, and slowly, reluctantly, turned to face him. Her face was pale in the flickering light, her eyes wide and shadowed. They were the eyes of a cornered animal, filled with a deep, weary fear. He could see the faint, silvery tracks of tears on her cheeks. "I'll be gone by morning," she whispered, her voice trembling. "As soon as the storm breaks, I won't cause you any more trouble." Trouble. She thought she was the trouble. The sheer, tragic absurdity of it was like a knife in his chest. He took a step forward, dripping water onto the floorboards. Elena. It was the first time he had ever said her name aloud. It felt strange and foreign on his tongue, but also deeply, fundamentally right. He saw her brace herself, her hands clenching at her sides. He took another step, closing the distance between them until he was standing in the center of the room, the table with her bundle between them. "I can't stand it," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he couldn't name. He gestured toward the bundle. "I can't stand seeing you pack to leave." He stopped, forcing the next words out, words that were harder than any physical labor he had ever done. They felt like pulling rocks from his own throat. "I was wrong." He saw a flicker of confusion in her eyes, a crack in the wall of her fear. She had been expecting anger, accusations, a dismissal. Not this. He dragged a hand through his soaking hair, the water running down his arm. He had to make her understand. "My anger, it's a sickness. It's a wall I build to keep everything out. It's not about fences or cattle. It's not about you. It's about me. It's a poison, and I just poured it all over you, and I am sorry." The word sorry hung in the air between them, as fragile and as startling as a wildflower blooming in the desert. Elena just stared at him, her lips slightly parted. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She said nothing. She didn't believe him. He could see it in her eyes. How could she? "All these weeks," he went on, his voice gaining a desperate, urgent strength, "I've been watching you. I've seen you work from sunup to sundown, without a word of complaint. I've seen you take the mess I made of this place and turn it into a home. I saw you stand up to those men in town, even though you were terrified. I thought strength was something loud, something you fight with, but your strength, it's quiet, and it's the strongest thing I've ever seen." He took a breath, his gaze locked on hers. "I saw your strength, and instead of honoring it, I tried to break it, because my own is a brittle, ugly thing. And I was wrong." Elena began to tremble, a deep, shuddering tremor that shook her entire body. The dam of her control finally broke, and a sob tore from her throat, a sound of such profound, heart-wrenching pain that it made him ache to hear it. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders heaving. She was crying, but it wasn't a cry of relief. It was a cry of fear and confusion. She was terrified to believe him. She had been fed kind words before, words that were nothing more than the sweet bait in a cruel trap. Promises were the lullaby that came before the nightmare. To trust a man's apology, to believe in his sudden change of heart, was to offer up her neck to the blade all over again. Her survival had depended on her ability to never, ever make that mistake again. Colt saw the war in her, the desperate desire to believe set against the deep, instinctual terror that screamed at her to run. He understood, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, that his words were not enough. They were just air. They were the same currency the man who had hurt her had probably used. He took one more step, slow and deliberate, rounding the table until he was standing only a few feet from her. He didn't reach for her, didn't try to touch her. He respected the invisible, sacred boundary of her pain. He just stood there, letting her see the truth in his eyes, the raw, unshielded sincerity that he had never shown to another living soul. "I know," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "I know words are cheap. They've probably been cheap to you your whole life." He looked at her, his heart aching with the need to make her believe. "So I'm not asking you to trust my words. I'm asking you to let me earn your trust, not with promises. With this," he gestured with his open, empty hands, "with my actions, from this moment on. Let me prove it to you. Let me show you that I can be a better man than the one you just saw." He held her gaze, pouring every ounce of his broken, humbled soul into that look. "Please," he whispered, "don't go." Outside, the storm was beginning to pass. The relentless roar of the wind was softening to a mournful sigh. The rain was no longer a frantic assault, but a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. The flickering of the lamp on the table steadied, its golden light growing stronger, pushing the shadows back. Elena slowly lowered her hands from her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed and full of a terrible, fragile uncertainty. But for the first time, the sheer terror in them had begun to recede. She looked at him, at his soaking clothes, at his earnest, desperate face, at the profound, unadorned truth in his eyes. She didn't speak, she didn't nod, but she didn't turn away. She just stood there, in the quiet aftermath of the storm. And for the first time since she had arrived at Broken Mesa Ranch, she truly saw the man standing before her, and he, in turn, saw her, and in that shared, silent gaze, in the fragile space between the thunder and the dawn, something new and terrifying and beautiful began to take root. The dawn that broke over Broken Mesa Ranch was not like any that had come before. The storm had passed in the deepest hours of the night, leaving a world scoured clean in its wake. The air, washed of its perpetual dust, was sharp and cool and carried the rich, clean scent of wet earth and bruised sage. The sky was a pale, luminous canvas of pearl and rose, and the rising sun cast long, clear shadows that seemed etched onto the damp ground. Every surface glistened. Water dripped musically from the eaves of the house, from the leaves of the lone cottonwood, from the top rail of the corral fence. It was a world reborn, baptized by the fury of the storm. Inside the small room off the kitchen, Elena woke slowly. For a moment, she lay still, listening. The house was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. The oppressive, angry weight of the previous evening was gone. In its place was a profound and gentle quiet, broken only by the steady dripping of water outside her window. She had not left. After Colt had made his raw, broken plea, she had stood, trembling and mute, until he had finally, reluctantly, retreated to his own room. She had not slept, not really. She had sat on her narrow cot for hours, the sputtering lamp casting her shadow on the wall, her pathetic little bundle of belongings resting on the floor like an accusation. Every instinct, every scar on her body and soul had screamed at her to run. Trust was a fool's game, a currency she no longer possessed. Kind words were a mask, an overture to a familiar, brutal opera of pain. And yet, she had stayed. She had stayed because of the look in his eyes. She had seen anger there before, and suspicion, and a deep, abiding loneliness. But last night, she had seen something new. She had seen a man stripped bare of all his defenses, a man looking at his own brokenness with a shame so profound it had shaken her to the core. He had not been trying to manipulate her. He had been confessing. Slowly, she rose from the cot. Her body ached with a weariness that was more than physical. She walked to the table and looked at her bundle. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, she untied the knot and began to put her few belongings away. The action felt monumental, a choice so heavy with risk it made her feel dizzy. She was not just unpacking a shawl and a chemise, she was unpacking a sliver of hope, a fragile, terrifying thing she had thought was long dead. She stepped out onto the back porch as the first rays of sun crested the mesa. The clean, cool air was a balm. She looked out over the ranch yard. The ground was dark and damp, the puddles reflecting the rose-gold sky. The world felt new. Perhaps, she thought, a person could be new too. Then she saw him. Colt was already at work. He was at the northern fence line, the one that had broken, the one that had been the catalyst for his rage. He must have risen in the dark, for he had already replaced the 2 rotted posts that had given way. He was working with a quiet, focused intensity, his movements economical and sure. He was not attacking the work with the savage anger of the day before. This was different. This was the steady, patient work of a man who is not just fixing a fence, but rebuilding something. He was mending the boundary of his world, making it solid, making it safe. Elena watched him for a long time. He was just a silhouette against the rising sun, a solitary figure engaged in a timeless battle against the forces of decay. But he was no longer just an angry, unknowable force. He was a man who had shown her his wounds, a man who had asked, in his own broken way, for a chance. She turned and went back inside, her path clear. She stoked the fire in the stove, put the coffee on to boil, and began to mix the dough for biscuits. The familiar, rhythmic work was a comfort, an anchor in the uncertain currents of the morning. She worked with a quiet purpose, her hands sure, her mind calm for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. She was not a prisoner here, not a stray. She was the cook. She had a job to do, and in that simple, practical reality, there was a profound sense of peace. An hour later, as the sun climbed higher, she stepped back out onto the porch. The air was warming now, and steam rose in lazy curls from the damp earth. Colt had finished with the fence posts and was now stretching the new wire, his body moving with a powerful, fluid grace. He worked without stopping, a man driven by a new and unspoken promise. Elena sat down on the top step of the porch, a place she had never felt comfortable enough to linger before. She watched him, and as she watched, she allowed herself to feel the faintest glimmer of something she had not dared to feel for years. It was not happiness, not yet. It was a quiet, tentative sense of belonging. The dripping eaves, the scent of the wet sage, the sight of that solitary man working under the vast, clean sky. This was her world now, for as long as she chose it to be. The sun was warm on her back. She closed her eyes for a moment, just feeling it. The warmth was real. The solid wood of the porch beneath her was real. The man in the distance was real. These were simple, tangible things, and she clung to them. She heard the crunch of his boots on the damp ground, and her eyes flew open. He was walking toward the house. Her heart gave a little flutter, a nervous bird in her chest. He wasn't looking at her, but at the ground. His face set in a neutral expression that was impossible to read. Was he coming to take back his words from the night before? Had the light of day brought back his anger, his regret at his moment of vulnerability? He came up to the well, which was near the porch, and drew a fresh bucket of cold, clear water. Then, instead of heading to the barn or back to the fence, He walked over to the porch. He stopped at the bottom step, just a few feet from where she sat. He still didn't look at her directly. He dipped a tin cup into the bucket, then walked up the 2 steps and stood beside her. In the silence, she could hear the water dripping from the cup onto the wood. Without a word, he bent down and placed the cup on the porch beside her hand. It was a simple gesture, a cup of water, but it was everything. It was an acknowledgement of her presence, an offering of care, a continuation of the promise he had made not in words, but in the quiet language of action. It was his way of saying, "I see you. You are here. You are thirsty." He straightened up and stood there for a moment, the silence stretching between them. Then he turned and walked back down the steps. He was halfway to the fence when he stopped and, for the first time that morning, he turned and looked at her. Their eyes met across the yard. The distance between them was no longer a desolate, unbridgeable chasm. It was just a space, a quiet expanse of sunlit, rain-washed earth. His eyes, that stormy, impenetrable gray, were clear. There was no anger in them, no suspicion. There was only a deep, quiet steadiness. It was a look that held the memory of his shame and the weight of his promise. It was a look that asked for nothing, but offered a silent, unwavering vow. And Elena, sitting in the morning sun with a cup of cool water at her side, looked back at him. She did not smile. It was too soon for smiles. But the fear in her own eyes, the haunted, hunted look that had been her constant companion for so long, had finally receded. In its place was a fragile, luminous hope. Her gaze held a question, a tentative acceptance, and the quiet, courageous promise of a new beginning. The story of their healing was not over. It had only just begun. The scars of their pasts were deep, and the land around them was still a harsh and unforgiving place. But as they stood there, a man and a woman in the quiet of a new morning, a silent understanding passed between them. It was a promise that had not yet been spoken, but was held in a shared gaze, a promise that 2 broken hearts, in a broken land, could perhaps, with time and patience and a little bit of grace, learn to trust again. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help even more, please hit the hype button to help this story be heard by more people. Your support means the world to us.